So today's sermon comes from an idea generated by Kendra Quinn and Zane Wharton, two new members of our church, who bought this sermon as an auction item. Now, when Kendra and Zane first suggested a hopeful topic on things in the world that are improving overall, where is Kendra and Zane? Oh, right in front of me. I'm like, who am I talking to? When you two. They suggested that we could find hope in progress. And I thought, yes, this is what churches and preachers do. We help us all to ground our spirits in hope. But I was cautious about this subject because our congregation is largely made up of people whose identities carry unearned privilege. In the scope of the big world, most of us here in this room are pretty comfortable by and large, and our privilege shields us from the suffering of natural disasters and oppression and poverty and war. Hope becomes a challenging topic when in the last few years we've seen white supremacists and religious radicals crawling out of the woodwork, and with the pandemic and racism and terrorism and environmental degradation, things feel like they're going to hell in a handbasket. But Kendra and Zane are onto something, because it is important to celebrate progress, and we need to do that to fuel our hope. So the trick is not to rest on our laurels, but to look around and see that our work and the work that other people have done has made a difference. The work of our ancestors in social justice, civil rights activists, folks who campaigned for women's suffrage, people who worked for child welfare laws, labor laws, for marriage equality, for reproductive rights. Hundreds and thousands, and over the course of history, millions of people have worked for a more just and equitable and sustainable world in their way, be it big or small. And in many ways, they have succeeded in their endeavors, one drop in the bucket at a time. In our modern world, we can look around and see the fruits of their labor. There are far fewer children working in mines or factories than there were during the Industrial Revolution. We know that malaria and malnutrition and air pollution have all been drastically reduced from what they were. 200 years ago, 90% of the world's population lived in poverty, as defined by a scarcity of food and protective shelter. Today, 10% do. In 1870, the average life expectancy in the world was under 30 years. And today, even in the poorest places, that number has doubled, and most people in the world will live into their 70s and beyond. In this country, just over a century ago, women weren't allowed to vote or own property or even open a bank account without their husband. And that's not that long ago. Women couldn't open bank accounts without their husband in my lifetime, and I'm not that old. In 1800, only 12% of the world's population were literate, and now nearly 90% of people in this world can read. Education has become far more accessible, and though we still have people trying to limit the education of girls and women, by and large, the world has shifted to women having far more rights and access and freedom. Violent deaths caused by war have been spiking in the last 20 years, but overall, it was much worse in the 20th century. So looking at the long-term goal, it's getting better. Now, climate change was something that was hard for me to be hopeful about, but emissions have been falling in the US, the EU, and the UK. Renewable energy use has increased by over 600% in my lifetime. And whatever you think of zoos, we can celebrate they are much more humane than they used to be. And now, when I speak about my friend and her wife, fewer eyebrows are raised, and they're not raised quite as high as they once were. So, many of us here remember when same-sex marriage seemed impossible to imagine. I remember when legalized marijuana seemed impossible to imagine. I remember campaigning for light rail in Denver in the 90s, and people thought I was a dreamer. I remember wanting an electric car, and now they are becoming more and more accessible in this country. I remember standing in front of the White House with my children in 2010 and being moved to tears to realize that a black family was living in the White House. When I was a vegan in the 90s and 2000s, nobody knew what that was. And now, the world over, most menus have a vegetarian and a vegan option. People are thinking more about the impact of what they eat. And when I worked in natural foods retail 30 years ago, what we called then health food stores were the only places to buy organic food. Now we can access organic food at King Soopers and Costco and Big Lots and all over the place. Good Times and Chipotle serve humanely raised meats. Schools have become more embracing of the diverse identities of students, and now when my high school friends and I reminisce, we remember how we normalized keeping their homosexuality in the closet in the 80s, and the whole don't ask, don't tell thing. My kids don't do that. I was recently driving a group of 13-year-old girls to a party, and they were like, we're all queer. This one's pan, I'm ace, she's a lesbian. My kids use they, them pronouns without missing a beat, and they are appalled and confused by transphobia and homophobia. They speak about body shaming and ableism and white supremacy culture with great fluency. That's just normal for them. And not just in my kids' progressive public school, but in the big public schools in our city. There has been a culture change towards inclusion and celebrating diversity. And many young people are very emotionally intelligent, relatively. They have an understanding of what the words trauma and neurodivergence and narcissism and gaslighting mean. This is revolutionary. These are important tools to be armed with in life. And now I know that this heightened consciousness isn't everywhere, but it is coming. It is coming. Ever since my beloved Sesame Street, and then Will and Grace and Ellen DeGeneres were first on the air, mainstream culture has been shifting by exposure. And just because the loudest voices in our country are sometimes the most hateful, overall, people of all ages are becoming a little more conscious of the experience of others. Awareness of others helps to grow our compassion, and today there is more discussion of how to be inclusive, accepting, and compassionate, and that is progress. A couple of us from this church were at the Together Colorado event earlier this week or last week, where they celebrated 45 years of doing the work of lobbying for equitable and just legislation in our state. Our church is a member of Together Colorado, along with 219 other faith communities and religious leaders. So those folks took a minute out of their gathering to celebrate that even though they've had many setbacks and challenges over the years, and especially this past year, many defeats and disappointments, the trajectory of legislation in our state has been overall towards more inclusion, more compassion, and more equity. They acknowledged the difficulties, but they also took a moment to celebrate all the beautiful, multicultural, and interdenominational relationships that they have been building the last 45 years. And you know what? Those folks love each other, and that's something. They see the overarching trajectory that they have helped to bend towards justice. One person from Together Colorado pointed out that they're super frustrated with the State Department of Housing. But 45 years ago, when the organization was started, there was no State Department of Housing. So in the big bucket of the world, these are all the drops. Will the bucket get full and we will create a world without racism and oppression and environmental degradation? No, probably not. But can we make this world a better place while we are here. Yes, we can. Here at Columbine, just here at Columbine, we made our gravelly, weedy backyard into a beautiful, welcoming space. And if just one person finds healing meditation walking our labyrinth, then we have done something wonderful. Yes, we are just one little church in one little denomination in one suburb of one city, and we probably aren't going to turn around climate change or stop gun violence or cure transphobia, but we will create a welcoming and healing and inclusive space here. We will plant xeriscaped flowers around our labyrinth. We will be working to make our little corner of this big world a better place. Our community is raising strong and kind children and youth with a heart for social justice. And our church has made a commitment to live into the covenant of the eighth principle. And Unitarian Universalism has grown and changed as well. And we realize that while our denomination could do better, as a whole, we are engaged in that work. Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray was and is the first woman president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And now Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt is on course, because she's running unopposed, to succeed her as the first young woman of color president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. We move, we change, we grow. As we become more aware of our world and we think beyond our own identities, things do change, and this is where we can take heart. When our focus shifts from solving, from fixation on the end goal, to building relationships and growing our compassion, then we do see results. The arc of the moral universe does bend towards justice. As Representative Chantel M. Brown of Cleveland said, Dr. King was right. The arc of the moral universe can bend towards justice, but only if we pull it. And people have been pulling it in that direction. Despite the greed and short-sightedness that plagues humanity and our modern culture overall, we believe that people are good and that good people are doing good things. The hate and the harm gets the headlines, but as I sat in that Together Colorado event the other night in a room filled with a multicultural, multi-generational, even multi-class group of activists working for change, I felt a kinship with these people who spent their lives working for the liberation of themselves and others, and historically as well. If we watched the movie here, Crip Camp, one night, if you can, I believe it's on Netflix, definitely watch that movie. You will see people in that movie in I believe it's the 70s, organizing there are people with disabilities who are organizing and working to pass legislation for equal access in public places. I feel a connection with all the legions of people who have worked the last centuries from their living rooms, who have attended endless meetings to organize for civil rights and fair housing, with the brave college students who started the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, in the 60s, who risked their lives to ensure that Ruby Bridges and all children and young adults of color had equal access to education. I thought about the older generation of progressives that I lived with in intentional communities who started Food Not Bombs and devoted their lives to sustainable living and environmental activism. Ordinary people, most of whom don't make the headlines, but who work tirelessly for change. And then there's the teachers who love their students and navigate all the obstacles that stingy taxpayers create for them. Healthcare workers who advocate for their patients and care for people with love. Volunteers in churches all over who serve meals and visit the sick and injured. And even the tender-hearted little children who include the one that's been left out. All of these little hands and big hands are pulling the arc of the moral universe towards justice. As Sue read for us today, Reverend Theodore Parker said, "You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right." Now, when he says triumph of the right, 150 years ago, he means justice, things that are right and good and true. He says, "I do not pretend to understand." He said, "The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. From what I can see, I am sure it bends towards justice." I love this quote because it's so Unitarian of him. He doesn't claim to have the overarching wisdom of God. Instead, he talks about his limited perspective as a human being. He embraces the first source of our UU faith, direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder. Now, that's our first source, and it had not been articulated back in 1852. That happened nearly 90 years later when the Unitarians and the Universalists merged. Then the articulation of openness to the forces that create and uphold life was officially listed as the first source of our faith. Reverend Parker didn't claim to know the outcome of things, but he did claim faith in the emergence of a more just world. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used Parker's image of the moral arc bending towards justice to kindle our faith in progress when he gave the commencement address for Oberlin College in 1965. He said, "We shall overcome because somehow the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Even Dr. King knew that he did not have the final and complete answer, but that he had faith that somehow we would get there. And if that's good enough for Dr. King, it's good enough for me. He gave his life in the fight for racial justice, and though he didn't solve racism, his work did bend the arc towards justice. Things have gotten better for the work of Dr. King and the work of Together Colorado and Food Not Bombs and the Second Wind Foundation that we will support in our offering today. Things have gotten better because all the people over the decades in their parlors or living rooms, talking on phones with cords, writing letters, and now sending emails, marching, speaking, building relationships, all of those people have moved the needle. People who accept others and care for others. And every day, when you live into the vision created by our 8 principles, look at them, they're amazing. You too are bending that arc and helping to kindle our collective hope that keeps us going. May you delight in progress. May you see victory all around you and yet never stop working for a more just, inclusive, and sustainable world. Blessed be, and may it be so.